Hi, I'm the Board Game Bandit, here with another edition of Smash Up, and I'm here with Sarah Trager and Eric Glassey. Thank you both for being here.
Glad to be here.
Thank you for having me.
Today we're going to be talking about what Smash Up is like as a tournament game. This was something that a lot of people had questions about. There are no official tournament rules. Most games don't have an official tournament rule set, so this is more of a brainstorming session. What have we done? What have we like to see done? And I'm really excited about it because I used to think that this was a terrible tournament game until I started playing in them, and now I want to do it all the time.
So what are the main types of tournament plays that we're going to be talking about?
Really anything that is longevity based. The idea is that you're playing multiple rounds with a large set of people. That's really all you need as a starting point, and then there are many ways that you can facilitate that, and I'm excited to hear what you guys have to say about the topic. Before we start talking specific formats, are there any things that you must have in your Smash Up format or things that you might be concerned about when organizing a tournament?
I think having a knowledgeable player base is really, really important for this game in particular, just because it's very easy for an inexperienced player to make a bad decision either when choosing their factions or if they're going against someone who is more experienced. It's very easy for them to get frustrated with the game. So I think having a basis of knowledgeable players is probably what I would say is like one of the most important things about a tournament style for this game, just so that everybody has a fun and pleasant experience as well as they can, and that everybody has kind of the same expectations for the event.
I agree. That was the first thing I wrote down.
I would say time and location. You need to have a good location for them not to have as many distractions or reduce the distractions as possible, like a local gaming store or even in someone's house if you're playing a smaller tournament style. The second thing would be time. Make sure that there's enough time to do all the different brackets.
That's an interesting word choice, time. I'm going to have some concerns about that in a little bit. Anything else?
Those are two that come to my head.
For me, and this is particularly funny because in a previous episode we talked about player counts. I agree with the experienced player that Sarah mentioned. I feel very strongly that two-player format should be considered whenever possible, which is something I really enjoy, and Eric does not, but he's wrong. And also very important, I think there's a need for an official judge, someone who is familiar with the rules, who is a neutral third party, who can adjudicate on some complex situations, which do exist. And I'm saying that as a fan of the game. I admit that even now, there are some situations I have to think very carefully about what cards are going to do when played in a certain order.
Yeah, I forgot. I think judge is definitely a critical element.
That's something that in college, I learned that was such a thing as a magic judge, and it blew my mind that there are people qualified to make decisions on rules on behalf of official.
I think one of the things that makes the authority of a magic judge recognizable and agreeable to players, though, is that there is a process to go through in order to become a certified judge for the game. So I think not having a tournament format that's like approved by AEG might be a bit inhibitive, particularly when it comes to having a judge, because I think judges are necessary, but I think having a judge whose authority would be recognized when there is no agency that is, imbuing power to that person to be a judge, I think it might get a little sticky there.
That's why I'm hoping the fact that the judge is a neutral third party not playing would help mitigate that.
What about when the judges are wrong, regardless of being ordained by the company?
Then maybe the person who's arguing for that case should apply for judgeship. Now,
I mean, that does happen in any game. There are magic judges who are just wrong, and sometimes they make calls that are wrong, and it still influences the plays that are going on at the table. So even judges who do go through, qualifying tests and all that kind of stuff are still sometimes wrong.
There's not going to be a silver bullet that makes everything perfect. I just know that even in casual play, when I see people playing Smash Up, anytime I see someone holding a card and staring at it, that generally means that either they don't know what the card does or they're concerned about how it's going to be used in some context. And I know that having someone who can explain that there are particular cards I know, Tooth Claw and Guns. That card constantly gets played in ways that have unintended consequences. I've actually seen it played in both tournaments where it didn't do something that someone thought, and in fact, if we were being literal, did something very bad. So, there's a little bit of ambiguity in some cases, and I think just having a point person who can, have the final say will just streamline, because otherwise people will just argue and no one will cede ground.
I think, too, it would be important to have somebody like that, a judge who could impartially decide one way or the other how something's going to go. Because even though we said that we feel like the number one priority here would be experienced players, there's still over 1,500 different combinations of factions that you can put together. So even an experienced player, I don't expect them to know what every single card in their deck does. Jim would, but I don't expect that of every experienced player. So I still think it's important to have a judge who could make those kinds of calls.
And I don't think a lot of people realize that the rules evolve with each expansion. If you look at the definition of the word effect, it constantly changes. There was a brief moment in time where shuffling a minion into a deck was not actually affecting it. It was the one thing that you could do to a minion, and then that was written out. So having someone who is familiar with all the rules and can say this is the definition of a particular term, because they do change from time to time, I think that helps the game. Any other needs that you would want to see in a tournament format?
I think that timing is important. In any tournament, you need timed rounds. And I think in Smash Up, if we sort out the player counts ahead of time, if we said, okay, we're only going to have, 1 versus 1, and that's going to be, 1 round of the tournament, 1 player versus 1 player, I still think it's really important to know how much time will be allowed, because if you get 2 sets of really good factions going head to head, it could take a lot longer than if one person just, wins in turn 3 kind of thing, which isn't going to happen in this game. But my point is that I think timed rounds would help everyone to know how much time the entire event's going to take, and it will also, if a round is going to time, then it's going to help players play differently so that they can hopefully take advantage of the situation.
I'm going to respectfully and emphatically disagree with you on that. I think timed turns definitely to keep the game moving, but definitely not timed rounds, because that introduces a delay of game where if someone is winning, all they have to do is stall, take a long time on their turn, and they'll win because of the round. I've also, to be fair, I have been the lucky beneficiary of this, but I was playing a format where it was 4 players and the top 2 advanced. This was actually the Gen Con format. Because the round was timed, I was under no incentive to actually win the game. All I had to do was win second place and help run out the clock. So I was stalling and helping someone advance. Advancing to the next round was more important than actually winning the individual round. And although I was doing it, I wasn't comfortable with it, but I was playing with the set of rules that I had been given that had been given to me.
I think having the timed turns would be fine. It would address the issue. I just don't think that we should not set any time limits on the game in any way. So I think not having timed rounds would be fine as long as you have timed turns. There has to be some kind of time limit attached to each game, because then players need to proceed to the next game. And if we're not all on the same page about what time our game is going to end or what time our turn is going to end, then the tournament could take hours longer than it should.
I would concede slightly if the time limit were reasonable. If people say a 4-player game should last an hour, well, that is certainly possible. That also makes it very easily to subtly delay the game. And, I'm not calling that cheating. I'm going to call it gamesmanship. And I don't really want that in a tournament format. So maybe I'll concede a little bit on the timed round as long as it's an actual, time with buffer. Any other concerns? Some concerns I had would be having enough bases. And depending on the format, you can do some really interesting things as long as you have multiple sets. I actually really like the idea of unpredictable bases. That way no one knows what they're going to get. And you may want to consider hate drafting out some of the top tier factions. And I'll get into that a little bit more. But now that we know what our expectations are across several formats, what types of formats would we like to see?
I think the two-headed two-headed giant format for Magic the Gathering would be a really interesting one to try to apply to Smash Up. Two-headed giant, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, it's actually team play. So there are 2 players on each team, and they go head-to-head against another team of 2. And they work together as a team, and they win or lose as a team. So I don't know what that would look like exactly in Smash Up, but it might be really cool if in some sort of two-headed giant version of Smash Up, like one player controlled one faction and their teammate controlled the other faction. That could be a really interesting way where you'd have team play, but each individual person was controlling their own set of cards as well.
What if they each had 2 factions and they were just allied in some way? That, you know, if one player won, they both advanced. Because I hadn't considered that, but I could see some really interesting opportunities there, particularly with a faction like the Elves, where you need to give a benefit to one player in order to get a benefit yourself. Imagine giving that benefit to your teammate.
Yeah, I think if they shared their points after breaking a base, like, you know, first player gets 4 and then the other second team. So it would be like a 2-player game, but with 4 people. So that kind of 2-player, I think I could get behind, Jim.
I'm writing this down. There's some interesting stuff there. You know, what if, like, suppose everybody split the points, and maybe it could be really interesting because you could have people competing on bases. You could have one team trying to break this base while another team's trying to base that base, and you want to do it that way. You know, you both get points together.
Or you still have the first player get, one. And so it's still a 4-player game. Everybody gets their separate points, but then they just combine their points at the end once they reach 15.
That could actually introduce some really neat areas for growth, because then it would rank individuals as well as the advancing teams. And there are some formats of tournament play where if you rank higher than other players, you get more prize support, right? So if you're top 3, obviously you get the most prizes, but if you finish in the top 10, sometimes you can still get prizes. So if you did some form of two-headed giant, but individually ranked players where their team progressed in the tournament, but each player was assigned tournament points based on how well that they did individually, then each player could theoretically receive prize support based on how well they performed as an individual, but their team would also receive prize support based on how well the team did. That could be really interesting.
I don't mean to hijack your idea, but I'm definitely going to think about this a lot in coming days.
Yeah,
That's
I like
fine
this.
with me.
Yeah.
Do you have any other ideas? And we could also talk about what you've done in the past. I know you've run tournaments, Sarah, but anything that you'd like to see that you haven't seen before?
Well, a lot of the tournaments that I've run in the past have been very casual, and that can be really fun, but I think one of the things that is not as great about just a casual thing where just anybody can walk in 10 minutes before the event and figure out that it's happening and want to play, I think sometimes that lends to players not knowing exactly what they're capable of in the game. And so I think that what I've done in the past with my tournaments is I have the big geeky box. I have everything that's ever come out for the game except the Munchkin edition. And we've basically, I've removed a few factions that I felt would be overpowered or just fiddly, maybe not necessarily overpowered, but fiddly, where we didn't want to have to worry about certain mechanics. Like the Madness cards I've taken out, any factions that include the Madness I've taken out of my tournaments. And that's because I'm playing a lot with inexperienced players or casual players, and they just wanted to have a good time. So we take out the more complicated factions, and then we typically snake draft from every faction that's left, with the most experienced players going last for their pick. So they get to pick, 2 factions back to back, but the lesser experienced players get to choose their factions first. And this is a super, super casual way to play. I'm not sure that it is a good way to play tournaments. It's fun and it's casual and it's laid back, but I think if we were actually going to have full-on competitive tournament play, we need to find a different way for people to draft their factions.
Yeah, and would you redraft after each round?
We've done it a couple different ways. I've done it once before where you stuck with the factions you had for the remainder of the game, and then I've done it where if you were unhappy with one or both of your factions, you could trade them in if you had lost the game that you played. we've also tried it where if you won the game that you played and you wanted to switch out your factions, you could do that too. But again, because I'm playing with casual or very inexperienced players, I don't feel like they always fully grasp what's available to them. And I feel like that undercuts some of the greatness of the game, because there are so many cool things that you can do with this game, to not know what they are and to just randomly pick something. I think that cuts out a lot of the fun and a lot of the capability that's actually written into the game.
Well, that's why we both said experienced players were a must for a tournament format.
Well, I think in a tournament you should have different categories, like your beginner players, your intermediate players, and your experienced players. So you're not leaving out individuals that want to get into it and become experts.
Well, that could be separate, I guess, sub-tournaments where it's self-contained. You know, like the beginner doesn't work their way up to the expert.
Right.
I would actually say that it might be better to have, so with formats, with games like Magic the Gathering and Yu-Gi-Oh! And Cardfight Vanguard and other games like that, there are multiple formats. So there's tournament formats, but there's also like open play, free play kinds of things. And I think having your lesser experienced players participate in some sort of ongoing free play, like, Friday Night Magic is a Magic type thing. And I know I'm drawing a lot of conclusions between this and Magic, but I think it's because in tournament format games, Magic is definitely top notch. They've got their tournaments figured out. They know how to run them. They know how to execute.
I also think that I've heard Paul Peterson himself say that he worked for Wizards of the Coast, and so Magic is definitely ingrained in the DNA of the game. So I could see where it would draw a lot of inspiration from that. And there's nothing wrong with mimicking something that works well.
Right. You pulling from the industry leader is always a sign of flattery for them. So
I think having like an open play format where new or inexperienced players can test out their decks, just like we do with other types of card games, that would lead to them feeling more confident about what they've chosen to play, or realizing, hey, you know what, maybe this faction combination isn't right for me. Maybe I should try something else. And then when they do have a little bit more confidence about their cards, then they can jump into the tournament. Because it's not fun for anybody in a tournament if there's an inexperienced player. It's not fun for the inexperienced player. It's not fun for the experienced players. So if they had time on a weekly basis where they could figure out how they like to play, what they like to play, how those factions play against other factions, that kind of thing, if they could kind of get their feet wet a little bit in a non-tournament but still a competitive format, and then when they feel ready, move into the tournament setting, I think that would be really good.
absolutely, I like that idea a lot.
I agree with a lot of what Sarah was saying, and it reminded me of a particular anecdote. I've played in a lot of tournaments, and there are some games I believe very strongly should not be used in that type of format. One of the games is Coup, a game where I have in fact been cooed twice on subsequent turns before I did anything. The first opportunity mathematically possible, I was cooed twice by my coworkers. But I've also played this game in a public setting where it's a tournament, so it's supposed to be official, you're going for a prize, and it just so happened that there was a 10-year-old who was also playing. So it was the opinion of everyone else that the 10-year-old should win. Now, my name is the board game Bandit for a reason. I'm not, if I'm teaching you a game, I want you to have a good time. If we're actually playing for the sake of playing, it doesn't matter who you are, I'm pretty much going to be ruthless. And the fact that you're 10 years old doesn't mean I'm going to hold anything back. Even if everyone else is trying to make the 10-year-old win, come on, it's a tournament. Don't be king-making the winner of the game.
I think that feeds back into having multiple formats of play, because if a 10-year-old is given a safe environment to play in where they're not getting smashed just because it's a tournament, then they get to learn the game really well, and they can be just as good of a player as a 30-year-old can be if they are given the chance to practice and learn the game just as well as anybody else. So I think that feeds back into how important it would be to have other formats to support tournament as well as having tournaments.
I have no regret beating a 10-year-old.
And
Welcome
I don't think
to
you
the real
should.
world.
Yes, I like to think that 10-year-old leads a lesson in disappointment in life.
Sound like my husband.
when I was when I was brainstorming some ideas, and there were some things that I already have in progress, an unlikely source of inspiration came to me, ironically, from Smash Up indirectly. And I'm probably going to be dating myself and losing a little bit of credibility, but I have to be honest. If you were a boy who played video games in the, mid to late 90s, early 2000s, admit it, you played Pokemon. The Big in Japan expansion that I just got that actually has a Pokemon faction. And when you think about it, there are 150 Pokemon, and you choose 6 of them in order to be your team. And when I was playing other people or going to the tournament in the game, the game actually involves a Grandmaster tournament where you have to work your way up with your team. Who is my team? Mewtwo, Articuno, Zapdos, Moltres, and 2 others that I can't even remember. They may have been rotating characters. In other words, the 4 undisputed best characters were my team. And who would I generally be playing against on other players? The same 4 people and 2 other random ones that they chose that were also, top tier. And I started to wonder, what's the actual fun in that? Why bother having bad factions conceptually like the Ghosts or the Innsmouth, the ones that are harder to use, if you could just be zombie robots and wipe the floor with everybody, or zombie geeks, which I actually think are even better. So why bother having these other factions? And I thought that the depth of content that Smash Up offers is only meaningful if you have a chance to use all of it. There's so many times when I say, like, I haven't been the steampunks in a while. I should be the steampunks. Who are they good with? And that really interested me, and I came up with a couple of formats based on it. I think we talked about this in the first episode, what I'm going to call the Grand Royale. In its current format, it has 3 players. Eric is one of them, but maybe not for long, depending on how this goes. Where you're going to play, let's say, 7 games with the same 3 people. Each player is going to draft 12 to 15 factions. Every round, all players will bring 1 public faction, and they will declare it, like, this game, I'm going to be playing robots, you're going to be playing so-and-so, and everyone does this, and they have a chance to all go back to the decks that they've drafted and choose a private faction, and then they go into the game, 1 faction being known, 1 faction being not known. So this is going to be a best of 7 format. It's not even a tournament, it's more of just a competitive play amongst the same group of friends, but you're forcing yourself to use as much of the content as possible, and it really gives you an opportunity to counter by thinking, okay, if this person is playing robots, I want to play princesses because they are a great combo for that. If this person is playing princesses, I want to play spies because spies are a great combo to princesses. It really emphasizes the mind game that is Smash Up.
So you're saying that you would get to choose one of your factions and the other one would be like a complete blind draw?
No. What I'm saying is you tell someone, everybody knows what one of the factions that the other people are bringing to the table, and then you can choose your second faction based on what you might think will either enhance yours or counter theirs. But at the same time, other people are thinking, oh, he's going to bring this, so I'm going to bring this instead. And so you have to think very carefully about what you're constructing. And because you can't use the same factions over and over again, you have to assemble 7 good combinations instead of, like 2 or 3 uber combinations.
So how would you do the initial 12 to 15 faction draft?
Well, as I mentioned before, you might hate draft out some of the top tier ones just to make it interesting. But there are drafting algorithms. The snake draft works out well. If you were to rank all the factions and use a snake draft, as long as you were consistent, each person would have the same value in draft because it would go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That is a balance of 7 every 2 turns. And there's also ways that you can slot it. That way each person has a chance going 2 back-to-back, though I don't think that's as big of a deal. So you just do that. Everybody drafts 12 to 15, so you got a little bit of reserves, and then you can go game to game based on how you're doing and what other people have done.
Yeah, I like that. Then you can really, not necessarily do Kingmaker, but you're like, hey, Jim's really winning. He has 1 point more than everybody else. We could all, make sure that if I have 0 points, Jim has, 2 points, and player 3 has 1 point, I'm going to make player 3 win if I know I can't win it. So king player has an effect beyond just that game.
It depends on what would be the winning scenario. Would it be the person who wins the most games? Would it be total points? Like when someone wins, the game stops and it's total points accumulated over the game. I'm sure that there would need to be some discussion about that. What you just said, actually, I didn't like it at all. Because again, that feeds into the whole, deciding who wins the game aspect of it. But I think that if you phrase it as, all right, total points accumulated over the number of games, and it's like, okay, we have a chance to basically cap his growth and just end the game right here. That way he doesn't try and pad it and do like I'm going to break 2 bases and, score a bunch of points. I think that would be an interesting consideration.
I think just throwing out a possibility is whoever wins the most, but say, in 3-player, if one person wins, only 1 game and the other 2 win 3 games each, that's 7 games, you need a tiebreaker. And at that point, however many points you accumulate in case it went over comes into factor.
You assign a point value to second place. That way, if Sarah and I each won 3 games, but Sarah won second place in every other game, and I had more last place finishes, well then Sarah's actually better. Now that would probably be the case that you would score more points anyway, but then there is such a thing as, points padding where, I win 18 to 14 versus 18 to 11.
Because I'm not a huge fan of point padding, but I like the idea of point allotment for places.
I do too, especially if you do the first 3 places, because in my tournaments, typically what we do is we award tournament points for the first and second place winners of each game. And the first place winner gets 3 points, the second place winner gets 1 point. These are tournament points. So at the end, the winner usually typically has 9 tournament points, right? And that means that they've taken first place in each of their 3 games. That can be problematic because sometimes, especially the higher number of players you get, and theoretically with a tournament format, we'd want 16 players or more. But the higher number of players you get, the less likely it is that you'll have a clear winner, because at that point multiple people can have done really well in all of their games. So I like the idea of having tournament points for first, second, and third place, because it means that, like you said, Jim, if one player goes really well, they take second in all of their games, and another player ends up last in all of their games. It defines the better player in the points that are awarded.
So Jim's talking about a 3-player game, and you're talking about like a 16-player game. I like the idea of crossing the player count with how you score the tournament, because then if AG, listens to this and goes, oh, I like their ideas, if they take this tournament point style and apply that across the board, so no matter what type you play, it'll be more consistent and easier for players to understand and apply as they play different tournaments.
Just to clarify, the Grand Royale is not a tournament. It's a way of, getting extended use out of your content to avoid, I'm just going to pick one Uber faction and I'm going to play that. It's a way of using the depth of Smash Up to your advantage and forming what will hopefully be a memorable experience for you and 2 friends. With tournaments, I still have some ideas, and I'm agreeing with a lot of what you're saying. The other thing about points versus tournament points is that, although this can go both ways, it doesn't take into effect the kind of victory that you get. For example, I won a game once 15 to 9 to 8 to 5. That's a much different victory from 15 to 14 to 14 to 12 or something like that, or a victory in extra innings. If you go solely based on the number of points, well then, if 2 people kept tying, does that make them better because they scored more points? No, the game just happened to go on longer. So you may want to consider point differential as well. How many points did you win by? Although at the same time, that could also mean that, well, you had a lesser opponent. So I think just something, maybe tournament points is a way of normalizing it, particularly if you're playing the same people over and over again. Or you could just do head-to-head, and that problem solves itself.
One of the things that I like to do when I have any tournament of any kind is I like to track each individual's score in each game in addition to whatever tournament points may have been won. Because then at the end, if there are any areas where it's not clear who should be ahead, you can go back to their individual points and add them all up from across the entire tournament, and then it typically will provide a clear winner. And so even in a smaller game where you're playing just 3 players over, I think you said 7 games, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so even in that instance, if you assigned any kind of tournament points, whatever, cool, that gives you an overall winner. But if you also kept track of each individual's points in every game as you played, then at the end, cumulatively, you would have, a more data to look at for any kind of trouble between, who may have won first or second, that kind of thing.
I'd like to suggest another format. This one actually requires 2 players specifically, but it's specifically designed to answer the Pokemon question of why bother having bad factions? Because, it's easy to say that, you had the better combination and that's why you won. And I call this my assimilation. You know the bracket ahead of time, and you know who your opponents are, and you know at the starting level what 2 factions everybody has. When you defeat your opponent, you acquire one of their 2 factions. You get to pick, but you abandon one of your factions and you take one of theirs, and this propagates. When you go to the next level, you abandon your original one, and then you take one of the ones that you just acquire. So not only does that force you to change it every time, but it also makes you play as your opponent, and it makes it harder for someone to say, well, I had the weaker deck, because now your opponent is advancing with your deck.
That's really interesting. I like that. So would you be assigned to who you play against, or would you choose?
That part I haven't worked out the kinks for. It's even hard because typically tournaments tend to be seeded, but how do you determine a seed in the first place? It might be that you can rank the factions based on just a number of categories. If there was a known rank and then you basically got placed where you were based on what the ranks that you drafted, I think that would be a way of solving the problem. Or even if you just had randomized seeding, the point is that you would really be testing your mettle, because if you beat someone who had a very weak combination, you're now being asked to advance with that very weak combination or find a way to mitigate it with what you have.
If you're going to be doing a seed, I think you should start with the weakest first. So otherwise, you don't. If you start off with 2 really powerful ones, you're never going to change, and you're never going to get the feel of assimilation. If you start off with the weaker factions all the way across, and you rank it so that you're always playing the weaker ones, and you're slowly playing tougher and tougher ones, then I think that could be an interesting concept.
Well, so the actual way to avoid, I don't see how people would actively draft weaker ones. I think the way to avoid it would be to invert it and say that your opponent picks which one you bring into battle. So that way, the opponent gets to decide, okay, I view this as less of a threat. And that way, they make it, they basically choose the handicap of their opponent. But since each person does it to another.
Well, what about this? You had the winner pick his next one, and then the loser can pick his other one.
I like that.
Well, that's what I was getting at.
I thought you were saying the winner picks the loser's one. Because I'm saying the winner picks one of his, and then the loser picks the other one, they do it to both of each other.
I'm not going to agree to that, because the loser is influencing something that they're no longer a part of, and they could be particularly vindictive about it, or they could unknowingly pick something that's if it's someone who doesn't know any better, they could unknowingly or even intentionally like to support the other player. They could pick, all right, you're going to advance with zombies. Like, why would you do that? You wouldn't do that. So I like the idea of both other players having control over what they're playing against. So either the winner picks from the loser, or the next opponent assigns from your bracket what you're bringing with you.
But that's where you're saying you're determining what someone has, and you say you just didn't like that.
No, I'm saying if you and I, if I beat you and then I'm advancing to Sarah next, I'm saying Sarah should choose from your factions, not you should choose from my fact. You should not choose from your factions what you're giving to me, because you're no longer involved.
So the opponent you're about to face chooses of the factions of the opponent you just defeated, which will progress to the next round.
Yes.
I think that's really interesting. I think at first I was like, well, okay, well, that's going to leave a lot of players behind when they start to get their weaker factions. And I was thinking for them, it would cease to be fun, but that's not actually correct, because what would happen then is, so one player advances well, and that leaves behind players who didn't advance, so that they can start to play against each other to format their decks a little bit better, so that they can also hope to progress in the tournament. And I think that could be really interesting, because it means that no matter how poorly you've done, there's always someone you can play who would give you cards that you want, so that you would feel like you were equipped to do better in the next round.
I see what you're saying. So it's a little bit of a staggered format. If you win, you now have to win with a weaker faction. If you lose, you're now playing, you're inheriting a stronger faction.
Exactly.
I like that a lot.
And it also gives the loser something to do, so that way, because a lot of times people tend to think tournaments are all about the winner, but the truth is that there's relative position. There are losers brackets. There's like, okay, I lost the first round, but I have the chance to be the winner of everyone else who lost the loser.
Mm-hmm.
And then you rank. I think in like a 32 team format, you might end up with like place number 17. So you still have a reason to keep playing.
Right, and it's one thing to win with a great faction, but it's even better thing to win with poor factions. Like, that's why I always see you playing with Innsmouth, trying to prove that they're good when they're not.
Innsmouth Rockstars, I jumped out really far ahead of you guys, and you were trying desperately to come back, and I won that game. It was close at the end, but I won. Yes, Innsmouth Rockstars. As a matter of fact, you said, what are their weaknesses again? Because that's how well they worked with each other. And I think you need a reason. And that actually brings up another format where I was thinking of, where you would actually start with, you had several rounds of drafting where the first thing you do is you select from weaker factions. So you're forced to take it because you restrict everyone else. And then whoever goes next then can go with whatever they feel is the best pair for that. I think this would be a way, if you were going to do this, I think that the person who ends up with the weakest faction should be the last one, the snake in the draft. That way they have the best control over what partner faction they get.
Yeah, because I personally think the last one where they get to pick two is the strongest position in a snake draft, because then you can decide, and that's for any game, Catan, where you can be like, I know where this other one's going to be, and I can work off my synergies that way.
But mathematically in Catan, I've proven that. So I'm agreeing with you there. But with Smash Up, I think that there are some, depending on the player count, there are enough sure number one draft picks that I'd be confident with them regardless of who I got. If you tell me that we're in a 16-player tournament and I can go Zombies or Rockstars number one, I'm feeling very good about my odds no matter who is left. I'm counting on the fact that, like, the best of the medium tier ones, if 50 factions, the 30s are going to be right in the middle. I'm actually thinking that's going to be, I can make a very good combination there.
And I think, too, we're looking at this as it has to be snake draft. But if we were trying to pursue some sort of tournament that looked something similar to something like Magic the Gathering, I think the better thing to do would be to have players bring their own stuff from home, bring whatever you want to play with. So then there's a chance that maybe the Rockstars go head-to-head against another set of the Rockstars. As long as the cards were clearly determined for one player, maybe I have orange sleeves and you have green or whatever, then we could still play any factions we wanted to, even identical ones, and it would be, I think in some cases that may not be the best, but I think that it could be really fun, and it wouldn't restrict players to having to choose from a snake draft format.
Were you reading my notes?
I was not.
I was saying, building upon that, if you had a 3-player competition where every player plays the same combination, like if you're all plant aliens, you're all, like you said, just different sleeves. So who really is the best with those cards.
Not necessarily, because there are some unintended consequences that can occur, and someone making a mistake, not realizing those consequences, can throw the game for someone else. I understand where you're going there, but then it's also really susceptible to the order of the shuffle.
Yeah,
That
that's what I was thinking.
There are some aspects of that I like. I used to be against the idea of playing, mostly because I didn't know anyone who had other cards than me. It was mostly my set. That's actually a strength of Smash Up. But to Sarah's point, the last thing I had come up with was the idea of the roster, which is where the idea of Pokemon came in. The idea that you come in with your team, and this is to balance out the fact that if you have more experience, you should be rewarded to it. If you have access, if you spent the time with the game to acquire more cards, maybe that should be an advantage for you. So you come in bringing your own cards and you bring your own team, and then you have some form of format. Maybe it's bring whomever you want. Every time you advance, you have to use a different combination. That way it's about the depth of your playing, and you can see, all right, this is my roster, and maybe there's something where, like, you know, you can age people back in after so many rounds. This is my roster. I'm looking up against what my opponent has available, what I have available, and then this is the team that I choose. I really like this format because I'm a big baseball guy, and I really enjoy the idea of, in the World Series, you have the rotations set in advance so that you know that, all right, I'm going to use this pitcher against this pitcher, and then I'm going to save, like, you know, this type of pitcher for game 2, because I feel like, you know, if we're out ahead, this person is more comfortable playing, you know, with the lead, or I feel like the pitcher in game 1 will throw my batters into a funk that pitcher 2 can take advantage of. It really emphasizes the head-to-head mental aspect of drafting your teams.
So what if you had, building upon that same idea, where you had maybe 3 people on a team, and you all have to pick factions, and they cannot repeat. So you each get 6 factions, so it'll give y'all wider depth. So not one person has 6 great factions. They still have to share excellent factions with other teammates. And together as a team, you must win the competition. I can see that for a larger scale, more player competition. Does that make sense?
I am understanding it. How long would this take?
Well, it would take just as many. Just instead of one person being the winner, you'll have a team be the winner. So say you have, 9 people, making it simple. You would have 3 teams of 3. You would have a first place team, a second place team, and a third place team, and that would be it. And then within that team, you could, determine who's the MVP, but you would still have to work with other people that are engaged in other games. And maybe in that format, it's only a 3-person game, and you're fighting with, the other 2 teams in a 3-person.
Maybe we should go full fantasy baseball style, do a draft, and allow trading within factions. Like, if you look and see where you're advancing, and it's like, yeah, I'm going to go up against this opponent. Maybe I'm going to swing a trade for robots because I feel like that's going to be the perfect counter.
I really like that idea. How would you allow, what would incentivize players in order to trade?
Well, I think you have to know what you're playing against. The biggest problem I have with casual play is that it can, and it's perfectly valid to just play overpowered combination versus overpowered combination. It doesn't emphasize the fact that you have to think of the counter and the counters that Smash Up does so well. Just for an example, everyone thinks that zombies are really powerful. How do you counter zombies? Number 1, geeks. Geeks have cards that will force the zombie to shuffle their discard pile. Also, you have aliens, cards that will put the Tenacious Z's on the bottom of the deck. If you can keep the zombies on the base instead of scoring, if you can move them to undesirable bases where they're stuck. Zombies can't destroy, they can't move, they have weaknesses. So specifically knowing that your opponent has zombies, you might want to swing a trade for someone like the Bear Cavalry, where you don't have to worry about destroying the zombies. As a matter of fact, you wouldn't want to destroy the zombies. What you'd want to do is send them to bases where they're just stuck, and they just stay there. I would like to see that aspect of Smash Up emphasized more in competitive play.
I think that would be really interesting. So if in that format we were doing that, and how would we decide when I would get to trade my cards versus when you would? Because if I get to trade before you, then I'm getting better picks, right?
I think that there'd be trading from round to round.
Based on like how well you did in the previous round?
Yeah, so what I would thinking is, again, you'd have some form of roster, and if you think of it like a division, which is what I originally did, that way you can't trade within your division, because then you'd be influencing, games that you're a part of. But you could, if you let's say you had 4 divisions, and each division you drafted from the big geeky box, so that way a set is completely self-contained within that division. But then you can say to another person, you really wanted superheroes, but it was drafted away. I've got a copy of superheroes that I haven't used yet. I'm willing to trade this to you if you give me this in return. Now, what you'd have to do is you'd have to make sure that it's equal value. Like in any fantasy league, there's usually a commissioner who could veto, I'm going to trade you a Hall of Fame player for a career minor leaguer. That's just not going to fly. I just think that might be fun, because it really, again, the goal is to emphasize the counter and the counter aspect of the game.
I think it would take a lot of work to set that up, but I think if we did it well and did it right, that could be really fun.
I'm expecting 2018 to be a big year for me personally for Smash Up. There's a reason why I put it on my 10x10, but I'm only counting specific games, particularly games with the weaker factions, because if I'm constantly playing my favorite combination, which is superhero princesses, although I think superhero rock stars is now my favorite. Those guys are amazing together. I'm not really enhancing the depth of my strategy anymore. I'm just doing the same thing over and over again. I would like to force myself competitively and force other people to go outside their comfort zone.
Yeah, that's one of the things I would say is a weakness, is that people have a tendency to always want to play the game, the higher factions, because they want to win. They want to have that enjoyment of beating somebody. But it's really important to challenge yourself to take on those weaker factions and use their talents.
Otherwise, why have them at all?
Yeah.
Right.
And I think, too, sometimes you can discover a faction that you really like to play when you step a little bit outside of your comfort zone. And I think that that's one of the advantages of this game, is that because there are so many different factions, and because each of them does play in its own unique way, when you do step outside of those factions that you always want to play, and you go and you explore a little bit outside of those, you can find some really cool stuff that you may not have stumbled upon to unless you pushed yourself, or unless there was some outside force pushing you to choose different factions. One of the best ways that I like to play, because I play very casually, not because I'm very competitive, but I like to just randomly pick factions I've never played before. And sometimes it's a terrible plan because they don't work well together, or they don't work well against who I'm playing against. But sometimes it's really fun because I'll discover things about the game that have been in my big geeky box the whole time and I've just never experienced before.
Yeah, I would certainly do that with one faction, where I'll take a random one, and I know what all the factions do. But if maybe, let's say, I'm given a random one that I haven't played in a while, then I can intentionally choose to see how this will work. Steampunk Dragons is an example where I hadn't played the Steampunks in a while. I figured that they would be very good with dragons. Unfortunately, my opponent agreed and took Steampunk Dragons, and that was a very intense game. But it's a way of not going back to the same people over and over again. I did that where I really liked the werewolves. So it was like, okay, who could I play to do well with werewolves? Just because I hadn't played with them before, but I liked the idea, not just thematically, but also the idea of, like, I'm good, I'm not, I'm good, I'm not. So then I just started trying, like, all right, maybe it's this faction. No, it's not. Then I stumbled upon Killer Plant Werewolves. Really, really good. Superhero Werewolves. Really good. Does anyone else have any tournament suggestions?
I have a question about tournaments, actually.
Sure.
Have you considered what you would do for prize support?
That's an interesting question, because given that it's a closed game in the sense that it's not a living card game or a collectible card game, the idea of giving away smash up sets doesn't kind of defeats the purpose. The idea is that if you like the game, you probably have all the content already. I'm very happy that I won another copy of the playmat. I will take as many playmats. I will plaster my wall with different playmats. If I had my perfect wish, if there was like an official Catan tournament, if there was an official Gen Con tournament, more official than the one that I won, the prize to design my own faction would be a very big incentive. I'm just saying I have lots of ideas. You should know you've taken most of them. I think that would be like the number one prize. I would go nuts with that.
Okay, so that would be probably more like a league format prize.
Yeah, like on a national level versus
again
at your local shop. How will your local shop support a tournament and offer prize support?
Entry into the national tournament. That's actually a common thing where you play at the local setting and then you advance the national setting. It's a great question and one that I don't really have an answer to. You could do the easy thing, and AEG has a number of great products. You know, if you want to say, here's Nightfall, a game that you might also enjoy, I'm sure people would love to have some copies of that. Just say that, you know, promote the company by, you know, all right, you liked our one product enough, you've won another one of the products. You know, I'd love to have some copies of Guildhall. It seems like a great game. Just saying.
That's interesting. I was just running the math in my head. If you did have 16 players, you charge $6 a head. That's a typical constructed tournament fee for the shop. One of the shops that I work at, $6 is our constructed event price. So if we did that, let's say we have 16 players. 16 is probably a little high, but if you got this off the ground, I think it's more than doable. I think it comes out to $136, or no, that's totally wrong. $96. Okay. So $96 is enough money for the shop to cover any expenses related to the tournament, plus provide prize support that it is doable. I think that you'd have to have a shop owner or manager who is open to the idea of using product that is not typically designed to be prize support as prize support. Because like for F&M, we give away packs based on the number of players who bought into the event, right? But we're accustomed to giving away packs as prize support. We're not accustomed to pulling a game off of the shelf that we would normally sell at MSRP and giving that away as a prize support. In fact, I know the owner of one of the shops that I work at is very, very adverse to giving away games as prizes for any reason. So I think that financially it comes down to about the same point as it would as if you were giving away like F&M prize support. But I think the mentality that you would have to get shop owners and managers used to use AEG products as prize support, I think that would be a little bit of a barrier.
So for some people that don't know, what is F&M?
Friday Night Magic. Sorry.
Friday Night Magic. Okay. Obviously, I am not a Magic player, and I had no idea what you're talking about. Showing my colors there.
So I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I believe the ability to play in tournaments is one of the reasons why Magic is so successful, because it gives a purpose to collecting the cards, and it gives something to aspire to. I think the more you promote a game and, you know, emphasize the fact that it can be competitive, I think that will help the game grow. And, you know, I think that formalized tournament play can do wonders for Smash Up. I'd like to see it happen. To me, $6 is nothing. I'd be happy to do that. Like, if you told me that I could pay $6 just to have the opportunity to play, you know, against competitive players for an extended period of time, I'd be happy to do that just because I value the experience that much. Throw on the ability for a prize for that, and I think that's great. You also want to think about the fact that if you're talking about 6 or 7 games, that's also time. The stores can sell snacks in the meantime, and there's a way to make it financially worth it, I think.
You tell Jim that there's a placemat and his mouth starts watering.
How many do you have? I have 2.
How many tournaments have I played in?
0, and you've won 0. I'm 2 for 2.
Which is why we need to play a tournament sometime.
No, because then it's going to be like, you know, we're going to get assigned in the same seed, and you're going to tell everyone, like, hey, I hear that guy, you know, he's won before. Let's all go after him.
He's undefeated. Imagine if y'all could defeat him. Victory will be yours, and then I'll snatch it.
I'm going to stop inviting you to things. I'm just saying that I think, you know, Magic doesn't necessarily have tournaments because it's successful. It might be just as much the case that Magic is successful because it has tournaments. Maybe, you know, and there's other games too that could fit the mold, but the depth of content of Smash Up and the act of drafting and formulating your team, thinking about what works well against others, it just lends itself to tournaments very well, as long as you force someone to not just go in with zombie robots or, a by-the-book top-tier combination.
So going back to player support real quick. So what stores could offer is basically paraphernalia, like play mats and other, maybe if AG has some concept art or something like that they could buy. So they're not giving away the game itself because, like Jim said, they more than likely have the game. And you don't want to necessarily introduce them to another game. You want them to keep coming back and keep playing games. And if you're the store owner, you want them to buy the games. You don't want them going, oh, well, if I can win it, I can just wait until it's in a tournament and it's a prize, and I can just come in, pay $6 and win a game if I'm good enough. But you want to give other things to offer.
I'm a big fan of trophies. I'm just saying.
If you have any ideas, listeners, please leave a comment below and let us know what you would consider to be a great prize.
And also great format ideas. This is mostly a brainstorming session. Most of these things are things that we'd like to see. I don't necessarily have just a gaming store lying around that I can use. Like, hey, gaming store, do you mind if I hijack your business for the next 7 or 8 hours? If you're a gaming store, I'd love to talk to you about some ideas to help promote the game and be a part of it.
I think one thing that could be really interesting is with the All-Star factions that they came out with in the All-Star event kit, it was one individually wrapped faction. And I think that there's maybe some room for growth there. Or if some of the future expansions, instead of coming out with 4 or 5 expansions in one box, if they came out as individually wrapped expansions instead, not only could you use that as prize support, but then you would have a cheaper price point at which players could acquire a new faction, and they could pick and choose which factions they wanted to get. So instead of getting 4 or 5 for, $20 or $25, they could get one for $5 or $6. And then in addition to that, continuing their product line, it would also provide some potential prize support for some sort of tournament format.
I have mixed feelings about that, if I'm being honest, mostly because I like the idea. It's a lot easier for me to wait knowing that, okay, that 70s expansion is going to have 4 new factions. It's easier for me to wait knowing that, there's 4 of them coming. I think maybe if they fixed it by saying, all right, we're going to increase the frequency. They generally do 2 4-team expansions a year. If you double the frequency at which they came out and said that, okay, maybe like every month and a half we're going to give you a new faction, and it's going to be sold as a pack, kind of like what Hero Realms does with the character packs. If you increase the frequency, I might be more okay with that. At the same time, I'm anxiously waiting for my Sheep faction to arrive. It's December. Sheep is supposed to be in December. I can't wait for that. So I don't know if it's easier to do multiple at a time as far as constructing the factions is concerned. I also sometimes like that when they tie in together and they're all based on the same thing. Like, I'm not the biggest fan of the Titans, but the idea that all 4 of them use the Titans, it makes it easier to accept the mechanic because it's not just like a fluke.
I think it would definitely not be as advantageous for players who are not playing in tournament formats, because really, ideally, this best suits the question of prize support for a tournament. But I think that it does it in a way that answers prize support for the tournament, but also still allows the company to produce the expansions that they already plan on producing, to do it making the same amount of money. It just allows the content to be used in different possible iterations.
What if now I see what you're saying. What if you had a dedicated tournament pack every year and it was different every year? Like this year it's going to be the All-Stars. I'm fairly certain that next year is going to be the Titans pack, where they're going to retroactively fit in some Titans into some of the weaker factions to balance them. I think if we were year after year, that would be giving people a reason to go back because it's constantly new. Actually, I think that would work out really well.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a really good idea. And I do think, now, if we're talking about tournaments on like a weekly basis, theoretically, that's 52. Probably you'll miss a couple here and there. So at least 45 different tournaments that you're going to have in a year if you have one every week and you miss, one here or there, holidays or whatever. So theoretically you're going to need prize support for those tournaments. And it's just not possible to come out with a new faction for every single week as the tournament prize support. But if they did come out with some kind of tournament pack on a yearly basis or, quarterly or whatever, and it was exclusive to stores playing tournament format, then they could have factions which would work as prize support for the game as well as growing the community, because the only way to get them would be pay eBay prices or participate in your local tournaments.
You had me up until you mentioned the word exclusive. Just because of Nightfall. The fact that I don't have Eastern Skies or some of the other promo cards, it eats at me alive, knowing that there is some aspect of the game and there is nothing I can do to acquire it. Really just grates my nerves so much. Maybe if it were exclusive for the first year as a reward for people who are involved in it, and then, generally available on the next year, I'd be much more akin to that.
I actually really like that better than what I said.
I hate being penalized for being late to the party. Martian Manhunter DC promo card, I'm looking at you. If I knew that there was... Deck building is one of my favorite mechanics. If I knew that there was a deck building game involving DC characters, I'd buy that the instant it came out. I've been buying them all.
Hey, Jim, did you know that there's this game called DC Deck Builder?
I do, and I have the 4 big box sets and a number of the character packs. I don't even play it that much anymore, unfortunately, because I think, unfortunately, Smash Up, it's like we could play the DC deck building game, or we could play Smash Up. Let's play Smash Up. I have to go out of my way to play it now, unfortunately. But, if I had known about it, I would have been absolutely all over it. But because I didn't know about it right away, and we're getting off topic, that's promos. That's a whole nother podcast that I want to get into. But I think AEG has done a great job of avoiding promos in the past. The whole sheep thing, they basically said, hey, everyone out there, you can get this promo. All you have to do is ask. And I thought that was great. That's how it should be done. And they're going to make it generally available later on. So it's a way of rewarding fans in the present and not hurting future fans. That's the only thing. I'm sure there's many other people who feel the same way. So sorry to get off topic a little bit there. I'm just really passionate about a lot of things board gaming. And apparently DC Comics, in case you couldn't figure out based on the videos. So as I said when we started, Smash Up is a great game for tournaments. I didn't always think that was the way until I started participating in them. Now I want to do everything I can to encourage them and to encourage you to give it a chance. It's a great way to stress your skill and to learn something new. As we mentioned in the player counts, the more opponents you face, the more the game will be enriched by the type of personalities that come into it. So I'm excited to see what the future has for Smash Up. Hopefully this can result in, the beginning of more formalized settings. I think that will help the game take off and have a very long life on the shelf. This was Smash Up. I'm the Board Game Bandit, and our game has just begun.